I will start by welcoming you all to this special webinar, joint webinar of a CIFAR network of innovation, equity, and the future of prosperity in the Monk School. While I let all the participants join us, I will start before thanking everybody and introducing the session by doing land acknowledgement. We wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. Before I officially start talking about our efforts and our first paper, I want to share our deepest thanks to, first of all, Stacy Balmer and Adam of the event team in Monk School. Without their background work, allowing this to happen and making sure we are all on the same page, and none of this webinar would have happened. And also, of course, to CIFAR and to each and every one of the co-author on the special issue, and to the journal Industrial and Corporate Change. The way that this webinar would work is that we have about 20 minutes for each paper, 12 minutes for presentation, 8 minutes for Q&A from the audience. Please use the Zoom tools, the chat, to ask your question. Each session have the authors present and also a chair facilitator whose role is to also pose your questions to the authors once they're done. And now, without further ado, let me start with sharing the first paper. And good. So first, what is it that we have tried to do? For the last 7 years, this group, the network, Innovation, Equity, and the Future of Prosperity, under the auspices of CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, has tried to create a radically interdisciplinary subfield of research that tries to put equity at the center of innovation studies and innovation at the center of equity studies. And when I'm talking about radically interdisciplinarity, I'm talking about trying to bring together in a discussion and constant doing research together people from engineering, philosophy, law, history, basically every social science that we can think of, and trying to somehow create a way in which we can all work together and get answers and moved. And those are two core problems of radical interdisciplinarity, which I'm sure many of the audience are aware of since they have been in those efforts, is that you need to create a common language and share definition of a research subjects. When you have people coming from robotics to people who are interested in the philosophy of law, you need to create a language that allows them to talk to each other, but also they need to agree on what is good research, what is even a good research question, how this research should be done so both fields can understand it and gain something, and how do you even know whether this is a good research? So the first thing that you need to create is a common language. And then you have a risk of that happened many times in those efforts of creating very, very high quality, but very desperate answers. So after 7 years, what you have is multi-dot, 30 papers, 2 books, 7 research projects, each of them narrow, each of them brilliant, but they don't really talk to one another and create a common understanding. And that's basically what we have been trying to do here, and what also the special issue is part of. And our strategy as a group was to create meso-level theorizing, so not the general theory of everything innovation and equity, or a theory that just explained a little bit of a case, but in the level. in the middle. And those theorizing create a framework that then allows very radically different studies and approaches to talk to each other and build a collective and cumulative understanding without either collapsing to a single methodology, which doesn't make sense, but also without becoming so desperate that those are people that are interested in the same subject, but they don't really talk to one another. To do so, we had two analytical moves. First, we focused on the how and the where, like the specific places, both real and in history and socially, where innovation increase or decrease equity, and also on how innovation can be used to increase equity. Second, we ground the frameworks in two things that my co-author will expand on, which we call practices, so what is actually happening, and places, which are specific places. And that allow us to develop an array and a set of specific different inquiries that together talk to each other. And the role of a special issue here is it forces us to explain and diffuse what we learned. So we had 7 wonderful years of a group with a lot of brilliant outsiders coming for one of our meetings. What we have not done, and what the special issue is trying to do, is come as a group, not just as individuals, and put to the world what is it that we have tried to do, explain it and diffuse it, and also put something which is very much a live research agenda. This is not the end. This is just the beginning. This is how we are trying to even think about research into the public domain, to steer further research and debate, but also, let's be honest, to get some good feedback from people that are at least, if not much more brilliant than we are. What does it demonstrate? It demonstrates our joint framework enables the field to remain radically interdisciplinary, which is a core value, while moving toward a common understanding and language, which is a core must. And it does bridge two very different communities until very recently of the people who really care about innovation studies and the people who really care about equity research, and put them together. And the core aim is to move from a field of separate excellence to a field with shared and cumulative logic. And with that, I will let my brilliant co-author Jane Gingrich from Oxford to explain our introductory and theoretical framework.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today and for the chance to discuss this special issue. So as Dan just said, our group, our CIFAR group, and this special issue is really motivated by a desire to understand at an empirical level, sort of why innovation is sometimes more or less equity producing, but also I think at a normative level to ask the question, like, how do we make innovation more equitable? How do we make it benefit more people? And one of the things that, as Dan just said, that our starting point is was sort of why don't we know the answer to this question? And one of the sort of things that we started with is when we look at sort of cross-national correlation, sort of when we look at patenting activity or other measures of innovation, you just correlate them to Gini coefficient. What we see is like fairly weak relationships, and yet we have much evidence sort of in the literature and also on the ground in terms of the way in which equity sort of innovation can exacerbate questions of inequity. So the challenge for us has always been to sort of say, okay, how do we take a step back and make an intellectual advance on this agenda? And what we did in this special issue, as Dan just said, is we made two key kind of moves. So next slide, please. So we try to reframe the question away from sort of whether innovation causes inequality. And this really is a debate that, as I think most people on this call probably know, has generated probably more heat than it has generated light in a sense. And we argue that the more productive question is sort of how and where. So this shift allows us to move from sort of the empirical argument about the existence of the link towards it really focusing in on the mechanisms behind it and the context that produce variation. And we think this is a research agenda that can really go somewhere and sort of illuminate some of these questions. So next slide, please. So as Dan said, the framework rests on these two concepts of practices and places. Practices are the routinized behaviors of social actors in the innovation process. So they're firms, governments, universities, regulators. And what we argue is that when we look at the behaviors of these actors in particular domains, and I'll explain what I mean by that more in the next slide, we're really analyzing things at this intermediate structure between sort of where political economists often look at, which is more at the sort of macro institutional structure and distributional outcomes, and the sort of very micro level, sort of firm level outcomes in terms of distributional outcomes. And so this intermediate level is where we think analytically we can make progress. Because we can see who is doing what, how things produce inequality, and sort of trace the process at a more sort of tangible level rather than at looking at sort of large structural forces. Places, so we take these practices, and I recognize this is very abstract. I'll try to be more concrete on the next slide, and we put them in specific places. So places are kind of the contexts in which particular practices emerge. So they can be workplaces, communities, regions, or polities. And the key move here is to go beyond just saying context matters, which is clearly both true, but also not that useful as a research agenda. But to theorize what specific features about context generate particular types of practices. And so the core claim kind of is that sort of there's no universal relationship between technological or social innovation and inequality. Place-based power structures determine which practices emerge. But our goal is to then, of course, take that sort of very general insight and move it to a more specific terrain. So the interaction between practices and places is really where this framework is going. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way that we do this is we look at sort of 5 sets of practices that are linked to sort of what we call different innovation identities. So innovators, consumers, workers, owners, and citizens. And these are the same people. So it's not that, one group of people is always an innovator or never a consumer. They're the same people, but they adopt different roles in the innovation process, and different inequality producing practices exist. And so we define 5 inequality producing practices within the domain of innovation that help us sort of understand why inequalities might emerge. So the first is network access. Who gets to participate as an innovator in the first place? So we know that there's substantial class, racial, and gender barriers in, for instance, STEM education, access to early stage funding, or elite networks that allow people to become innovators. And so the first question is sort of systematically, what are the institutions, policies, or organizations that narrow or open the pipeline into the innovation process? The second set of practices we look at is targeting. Who is innovation designed for? So in some sense, some consumers are better served than others. And what is it that shapes these outcomes? What structure of incentives, whether at the firm or at the sort of broader level of consumer financing, might shape whose interests are served? The third is our practices of control. How are technologies deployed, particularly in the workplace? And here the question, and we'll talk about this a lot more in the next 2 presentations on the more substantive papers, is on sort of who decides how technology is used, how is it deployed, and what are the institutions that shape that variation. The fourth is kind of the capture and sharing of gains. Who actually benefits financially from innovation? So publicly funded research might have different sets of outcomes than private or privately funded research, particularly in the current marketplace. And so the specific institutional choices that shape the sharing of innovation rents can be very important. And the third is about the fifth is about democratic control, the embedding and disembedding of particular processes that communities might have over the oversight of innovation processes. And the institutions that produce more or less equality on each of these can vary. And so things that make innovators more equal might not actually make consumers more equal. And so it's really this disaggregation of these practices that is the kind of conceptual insight that we make in terms of making progress on this research agenda. Linking up these practices, and they're not sequential steps, they interact and overlap. But linking them up in specific context is the place part of this agenda. And so this is where we try to look at the sort of configuration of practices and how they work together to produce particular inequality producing outcomes. Next slide, please. And so I won't go through all the papers, but there's 4 papers which you'll hear about today. The first one that I'll present is on workplace governance and workplace power and the way it shapes technology. Then we have another paper that Dan and Ken, Karen Levy, and Amos Zahavi have worked on workplace surveillance. And these both look at the workplace as the key place and the context in which shapes outcomes. And then there's 2 papers that look specifically at regions and communities as places, and these will come sort of later in the workshop today. Lee, Kim, and Zahavi look at the question of regional growth policies comparing South Korea and Israel. And Brantner, Sorensen, and Feldman look at this more sort of generally at the question of what makes a place prosperous, and try to understand this constellation at the level of a community between prosperity and equality. And so this is where we're going over the next hour and a half. And I guess next slide, I'll just wrap up here. So thank you very much. And we look forward to more discussion.
Thank you so much, Jane. Great kickoff for us. I'm Ken Lee Partido. I'll be hosting this part of the webinar and also presenting later. I'm a historian at Florida International University in Miami. So please put your questions in the chat. We have 2 great resources at our disposal. One is we have time for questions. And 2, we have a lot of talent out there in that audience. So let's activate that talent and bring it to bear on what we just heard. I'll give people a second. And if you don't ask a question, you'll just have to hear from me. So come on now, don't be shy. All right, I will start us off. First, I think it would help a little bit if Dan and Jane, you could tell us what you mean by innovation. I mean, in one sense, that's obvious, but I think there's perhaps a tendency to assume that it all revolves down to technology or automation or something like that. So how are we defining technology here?
So, excellent question. I think that a good way to think about it, and we have a very broad definition of innovation, is to differentiate between invention and innovation. So if invention is the act of coming up with an idea to improve, to do whatever, and it can even end up, if you want to go to the technology side, in a patent, innovation is actually applying those ideas in the reality. So if you talk about the market and the economy, it's new, improved products and services, but also everything, it's continuous. It's everything from first introducing them to a market, to improving them, making them work with others. How do you sell them? How do you maintain them, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that goes on for hundreds of years if you think about some technologies. And now you know you do because you're the historian in this panel. But this is also a definition that works for other and what we call social innovation. It is the innovation is the act of putting the idea in practice. And I'll stop here unless Jane wants to add anything.
Okay. Any additions to that?
No, I think I think that covers, and I think that the insight that the distinction between invention and innovation is critical because the sort of novelty in and of itself is only sort of part of what matters, it is this process of diffusion of the particular technologies or social practices that we would call innovative. And it's that thinking about that diffusion process and the way that it happens that gives us this scope to kind of cut in and think about sort of, okay, well, where are the points at which inequalities can emerge or not emerge? So, of course, invention, access to being inventive is itself something that is highly unequal, and there's plenty of work looking at these kind of lost Einsteins, lost Marie Curies, and sort of like why that process is more or less equal. But the diffusion of innovation is where actually a lot of the action is, or the diffusion of inventions, what we would call innovation, is where a lot of the action is in terms of shaping inequality producing practices or limiting them. And so it's sort of disaggregating these components and really thinking about, okay, well, what produces something innovative? It's a whole series of practices that quite different actors are undertaking, and each of those can have different inequality producing components to them. And it's that sort of slicing it that what we're trying to do to sort of make some progress on this question.
So we have a question from the audience. Okay, let me read it. Yes, I see. Is the intent of the initiative to help bring forward actual policy proposals or take time-sensitive or space-place relevant public positions as policy proposals, time-sensitive, space-relevant public positions? For example, pending changes to federal employment equity in Canada. I could read it again if I didn't catch it quite right.
Well, I can cut into this a little bit and then maybe move over to Dan. I mean, so I think the intent of our group, it is an intellectual group. So we're academics. We're trying to publish in academic outputs. We want to understand the world. But from the outset, and really Danny was the founder of the group, so he can speak more directly from this. But from the outset, we've always had the intent to be in dialogue and both learn from policymakers and communicate what we've learned to them in a sort of reciprocal dialogue. Now, one of the kind of ways in which sort of what we've just been saying applies to specific policies, though, is that I don't think that there's a one size fits all, like if you just fund R&D like this, you'll get more equity. So the challenge that like what I think you would take from a sort of applied policy perspective from what we're doing is that you need to think about specific practices and the ways in which policies can affect them in a given place. And so some of the work, say for instance, Dan's doing on the mining sector and the sort of practices, say, are either around like the labor side or employment, but also R&D and mining. The kinds of policies that might be either allowing more access to innovators, or that are allowing more progressive kind of outcomes in terms of employment might look very different than, say, the work that others in the group are, say, doing on hospitality. So our goal is not to sort of come up with one set of policy recommendations, but a set of tools that would allow people to approach policy questions in ways that are sort of distribution or equity sensitive. But Dan has worked specifically on this, so I'll turn over to him to jump in on this.
Okay, so I think that this is important to say two things. One, this is under the auspices of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. So by definition, the aim is to create a new subfield of research and fundamental scientific understanding. However, we are all committed to not keep it in the university, but to put it in the world. And indeed, as you will see in at least the 3 of the 4 papers that you'll see today, those are already happening in the world. So Jane mentioned mining. Ken, Amos, Karen, and I are now doing a research about the use of surveillance in the hospitality industry, where we engage with workers, unions, and management. The group as a whole have done special workshop for policymakers. The last one was actually in the UK, not in Canada. Maybe the Canadian government should also organize something like the British government did with our network. And we, as individuals, of course, each one of us has been significantly involved in multiple policies. So the aim is, yes, to influence reality, but we are doing it based on the metrics and aspiration of any program under CIFAR, which is to create fundamental new subfield of research.
That's great. We are now actually a little bit past 10:55. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Jane. Just one housekeeping note. It looks like if you want to ask a question, you should use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Maybe both will work. So, okay, Dan. I think you're hosting the next session, so let's move on.
Yes. So, first, thank you so much, Ken, for facilitating that. And it is my pleasure to introduce the first practice paper, which is on workplace governance and labor perceptions of technological risks and benefits, which was written by Jane Gingrich in the University of of Oxford, Nicola Wu of the University of Toronto, and Bao Bao, which I have seen and hopefully can join us. Because she just celebrates becoming a mother. So I highly admire your tenacity and dedication to the cause, Bao Bao, who is just joining us from Syracuse University. And I will be facilitator. I'm going to shut up. I don't know which one of you wants to share the presentation. The floor is yours.
Can you
want to
see?
go ahead, Jane?
Yeah, sorry, I was talking and I realized I'm on mute, which, I should know at this point, especially in a technology seminar. Okay, more from me. You'll hear more from me. I'm going to present this paper that was co-authored, as Dan just said, with Baobao Zhang and Nicole Wu. And this is a theoretical paper. What we're trying to do is set out a framework for thinking about the way in which worker power might moderate the way workers respond to technology. I'm going to talk a little bit at the end, time dependent, about some empirical work that's coming out of this, which Bao Bao is really spearheading. Okay, so let's start with what we're trying to do in this paper. Let me start with the summer of 2023. In the United States, across that summer, we saw an extraordinary wave of labor unrest. And what was striking about this unrest was that technology was explicitly at the center of many disputes. And so screenwriters were striking over the use of generative AI, auto workers were demanding contractual protections against EV automation, longshoremen were walking off semi-automated docks. So in each case, workers were not just asking for more money, they were demanding a say over how technology would be introduced in their working lives. This labor activism, though, stands in contrast to a sort of strong amount of quiescence or lack of activism in many sectors in which current technology seems to be, in fact, quite significant. Lawyers, doctors, financial analysts, workers whose jobs arguably face comparable or even greater disruption, particularly from generative AI, engaged in almost no organized responses. And in fact, many report liking the sort of new kinds of technology. And at the level of voting, fewer than 1 in 10 Americans reports being very worried about losing their job or displacement to a robot or AI, and very few mobilize politically on questions of technology. So in this paper, we want to take workers' responses and think about them along these 3 dimensions. So first, this question of sort of valence. How do workers actually feel about technology? Why are some anxious and stressed out by it and others sort of trust it or are even really optimistic about it? Second, actions. What do workers actually do with technology? Do they block adoption? Do they resist it? Do they acquiesce? Are they active diffusers or innovators themselves in their workplace? And third, what we call spillovers. Does the workers' experience of technology in the workplace shape their political preferences and behavior more generally around things like regulatory preferences or vote choice? So what we do theoretically is we sort of set up these 3 distinctions in sort of the way workers can respond to technology and try to think about sort of what might explain variation within them. And our kind of core argument, the claim of the paper, is that you cannot understand how workers respond to technology without taking the work context seriously. And taking the work context seriously often means sort of zooming down a level from our traditional analyses that look at just survey respondents embedded in kind of institutional settings to really think about workers at the firm level, which I'm going to argue at the end, I'm going to come back to this question, poses a real methodological challenge for contemporary researchers because analyzing people embedded in firms is very difficult. Okay, so why do we think the workplace is so important? So our core claim is that workplaces are not just sites of economic production, they're domains of power and contestation. And that the form that the power takes in the workplace shapes both how technology is employed and how workers think about it. So it has this double function. Now, the idea that workplaces are sites of power is obviously nothing new. There's a rich literature coming at this question from many different angles. But still, as it's applied to technology, we think that there's actually quite a lot of slippage in this literature or sort of blind spots that require more theorization. So much of the work in kind of management or organizational studies really looks at how workers respond to technology at the ground level. And finds kind of variation across firms of the type that we're looking at. But much of this work kind of abstracts this variation away from the questions of power relations or structures of control at the firm level. Political economists, by contrast, really do look at these questions. So they look at how unions or varieties of capitalism or welfare states might, at the sort of macro institutional level, shape technological adoption and actions. But this remains quite zoomed up from the context at which individuals are actually embedded in and the control that they have over their workplace. And so what we want to do here is bridge these two literatures through mid-level theorizing, in which we really look at sort of trying to make some progress at specifying power dynamics at the firm level and the way in which those are likely to affect those three kind of outcome variables that I talked about on the previous slide: valence, action, and spillovers. So to do so, we basically make two analytic moves in the paper. First, we distinguish among types of power, and second, we distinguish among types of technological affordances, and this leads us to a series of more concrete predictions. So to start with power, so we distinguish three types of workplace power. The first is kind of collective power, which is probably the type of power that's sort of most familiar to everyone, which is unionization or the organization of labor at the industry or some level above the firm. So it could be the whole labor market. The second is organizational power, and that really is about kind of employee voice within the firm, and that could come from formal rules. So in some European countries, there are formal institutions like works councils or co-determination arrangements, but it could also come from more informal structures of consultation, so flatter management structures that give employees voice within the firm. And then the third is positional power, which is an individual's location within the firm hierarchy. Now, what we argue is that each of those types of power gives workers different levels of control over technological adoption and also frameworks for understanding it that will politicize it in varying ways. On the technology side, we start by saying, okay, you've got these different types of power, and those are going to shape how technology is adoption. Obviously, not all technology is the same. So we just make two broad distinctions in this paper between technology that affects task structures, so what we call producing and coordinating technologies. So these change how work is done, how tasks are bundled together and coordinated. So this would be like robotics, ICT, communications technologies, and so on. And then behavioral technologies that affect behavioral autonomy. So this is monitoring and deciding technologies. And so these are things like algorithmic management systems or workplace surveillance. And our argument is that all three types of power moderate the distributive consequences of technology by shaping either task structures or the limits on autonomy, putting guardrails on those. And that as a result, they have spillovers to how workers feel about technology. Okay, so let's start with unions and collective power. So this is again the most recognizable part. So one of the big things that unions do is they shape both how tasks are distributed across workers, so how tasks are bundled, whether workers have sort of modularized tasks or workers have like a rich task structure in which many tasks are bundled together. And they also shape the guardrails around surveillance and monitoring technology. So in both cases, what unions do is they effectively can reduce the downside risks to technological shifts by ensuring that workers have richer task structures or that monitoring and surveillance technology is used in ways that are not punitive towards workers. So, in some sense, by moderating the costs of technology, one might assume that unions should just make workers more favorable towards it. But we argue that that's actually not always the case. So we expect collective power to have mixed effects. On the one hand, unions can use their bargaining leverage to limit the job displacement and de-skilling, which should reduce the negative effects of technology on sort of negative valence. Sorry, the effects of technology on negative valence. But collective power can also surface conflict. Workers in unionized environments tend to be better informed about the risks technology imposes. Um, and because the union is itself actively communicating those risks, it can also be a target for employer action. And so in this case, collective power does not necessarily make workers feel better, but it does make them more aware. And this leads to our two kind of core predictions. First, that collective power will expand the repertoire of responses available to workers, whereas absent workers are largely left with acquiescence or exit as their options. Where it's present, they can also block adoption and engage in negotiated acceptance where they receive concessions. And it has also critical effects on spillovers. Unions provide members with information and frames and organizational resources that allow them to engage in broader political mobilization. So if you want to understand why tech anxiety becomes a political issue in some contexts and not others, we argue the presence of or absence of collective power is very critical to this process. Now, how does this sort of union baseline differ from other forms of power in the workplace? So whether someone's hierarchically up or down in a firm management structure, or whether there's forms of co-determination or employee voice. We argue that those actually work quite differently. So both organizational and positional power can moderate the way technology is used in a sense of increasing positive valence. So individuals, we know from many management studies, if they have more control over their the deployment of technology, they tend to be happier with it. But these forms of power don't have the same kind of awareness building effects that either mobilize action or political spillovers. And as a result, voice doesn't surface necessarily the same concerns or repertoire of actions as sort of collective forms of power. And so here we see a more sort of quieter or informal means to affect technology, which creates some forms of acceptance. So it's still better to have employee voice within the firm in terms of control over the technological process, but not necessarily politicization. And we argue this operates slightly differently for task-based technologies and surveillance ones, with the former being much more open and workers with more organizational power be much more open to the former than the latter. Positional power operates quite differently. Again, workers here with more positional power have more control over how technology is deployed around them. And workers in coercive power positional structures with little autonomy and high surveillance might bear the most negative consequences of new technology, but have the fewest tools to respond to it. And so we'll see acquiescence and depoliticization rather than the mobilized political spillovers. So this is basically the sets of predictions that we make, where we try to map out sort of how these different forms of power intersect with technology to create different repertoire of attitudes and actions among individuals, both at the workplace level and politically. And I'm not going to go through all of that because I'm very low on time. Okay, so what do we do? This is a sort of theoretical exercise, but what do we do to sort of move it forward in an empirical sense? In the paper, we offer sort of two sets of recommendations. So the first is that this is, in some sense, understanding people's actual context and the power that they exert in it is a incredibly difficult and expensive undertaking. And when you add into that the intersection with different technological affordances, one can have a sort of a project that would be unwieldy. So we make two arguments in the paper, one about the critical role of interdisciplinary collaboration, so that teams that can sort of study power in different contexts and look at them from different angles actually will have a much larger effect, much larger ability to sort of understand these dynamics than in individual study looking at things in isolation. And secondly, we propose more kind of collaborative and centralized repositories for case studies, because again, understanding these dynamics requires really going into the firm level, which can be very difficult to do with survey or other kinds of techniques. But there are still ways to kind of scale up from the work that individual case studies are doing. That said, Bao Zhang, one of the collaborators on this study, has taken this project forward in a really impressive way and run a citizens assembly and follow-up survey that really has looked to sort of probe how individual workers are thinking about technology and questions of power. And if there's time, maybe she can talk more about that. So what we've done is we propose this kind of mid-level framework, again, building on the practices and places, that looks at sort of theorizing the specific components of place and the way practices might operate in it relative to certain power structures. And we've come up with a series of arguments about sort of how to take this research agenda forward. And some people on our team are taking it forward. And so watch for what comes next in terms of this. Thank you.
So first, thank you so much for this presentation, which was packed. I had the questions. There's also another question, so I'm going to merge both of them together because I know who will give me a good answer. But I also remind people that if you want to ask questions, you can use the question answer tool in the Zoom at either the top or the bottom. But if that doesn't work, you can also try the chat. But first, the first question, which I would love Bao, since Jane basically volunteered her, to answer is, okay, sounds very, very interesting. How do I do this research? Including what method you think I should use? This is a question that came from the audience.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. So there are different methods that we investigated in the study, including people who conducted ethnographic research by actually embedding themselves within the workplace. So in terms of the research that my team and we try to implement is to be able to do this type of work, but maybe across a different sectors. So instead of doing ethnographic research, we conducted a citizens assembly with 40 workers from all across the US, from different regions who have different work experiences, levels of education. We brought together these folks on Zoom, and we had expert witnesses who are interdisciplinary. They include machine learning researchers, as well as those with labor economics backgrounds to present to the participants, and the participants deliberated and shared their own experiences about technology being implemented in the workplace and their views about power and how that impacts their experience dealing mostly with AI in the workplace. So one interesting research finding that I want to share that kind of extends beyond our paradigm, which I hadn't even thought of, is sort of not just power between managers and employees within the firm, but also the role of the tech companies, which are highly concentrated, very powerful players, at the geopolitical level at this point, and even managers or business owners, because we're so reliant now on this subscription-based system for a lot of emerging technologies. Just think Claude or Codex or ChatGPT. That also introduces a power dynamic where people who might have a lot of positional power within the firm are now dependent on these tech companies. So that was just an interesting theorizing that these participants came up with that we didn't even think about in our theoretical paper. So it was a really wonderful experience talking to these 40 workers. They did validate a lot of what we theorized, but then also extended beyond what we had theorized.
Okay, so one last and very quick question, or at least quick answer, because we're running out of time. I know that there's a lot of people that are either policy makers or work in NGOs or try to do things in the social and private domain in the audience. So would you recommend to them that as they look at those issues? We are in Canada. What should we think about when we look at workplace, workers, all those new technologies, all those different power dynamics that Baba just talked about? How should both companies and policymakers should think about those issues, and what is it that you would want them to get out of this research?
I can quickly jump in on this. So I think there's a few things. So everyone knows sort of private sector unionization has dropped fairly dramatically over the last 30 to 40 years. And one of the ways in which policy has looked to respond to that is to kind of expand individuals' kind of exit options from work. So to think about like allowing workers more power in the marketplace by allowing them to switch jobs more and so on. But our work would suggest that this is really not a substitute in any way for thinking about other forms of kind of collective or organizational power. And yet, sort of going back to some world in which you have kind of mass private sector unionization is unlikely. So one of the kind of policy questions is sort of like, how do you think about building worker power in 2026 in a sort of more liberal market economy that exists in a country like Canada? And so there could be some fresh thinking on like, okay, could you make something like a kind of more portable form of like sort of forms of unionization or forms of worker organization that are sort of more portable, less firm based, more linked to the contemporary moment. So for instance, like there's some work that's actually being done at a think tank that I collaborate with in the UK on sort of portable worker power benefits. And these are things that are kind of interesting new ideas that are trying to get at a sense of like, how do you give workers more voice in the firm or more ability to control the use of technology in a kind of an economic structure that really isn't built for that. And that when you're not going to reverse the tides of time on some of these things. So there, I think there's some creative thinking that could happen. And then for policymakers as well, thinking about now as you're beginning to deploy AI within government, and you're actually going to see sort of your own jobs change, or all of us are seeing our own jobs change. What are the ways in which the public sector as an employer can be thinking about sort of actually giving frontline workers, civil servants, and others more ability to experiment and use technology in interesting ways rather than just as a kind of a punitive or efficiency saving measure?
Okay, thank you so much. By the way, for the audience, you know who are the authors. If you have questions after that, we're all academics, very publicly, and in this case, all work in public universities. Feel free to send us emails. So without further ado, I'm giving the floor now to Jane to present the next paper.
Yeah, so everyone's going to be sick of me. This is the last time I speak, I think, except at the end of this presentation. But I will turn over to Kenley Petito and Amos Zahavi, who are here to present on workplace surveillance.
Okay, so this is our article, and myself, Amos, who will speak after I do, and Karen Levy could not be with us today. Yeah, I'm still good. All right, there we go. There we go. Okay. How's that? Better? Maybe not. Okay, well, maybe not. So our approach really, or our article really kind of follows quite well from what Jane just presented. We drill down a little bit more specifically into the question of surveillance in the workplace. The place is the workplace, the practice is surveillance. And we're interested in a lot of the same issues, but we're particularly interested in the impact in terms of workers' experiences in the world, an increasing world of surveillance. And our level of analysis sometimes is at the level of firms, but is often at the level of industries, specific industries, whether it's manufacturing, services, hospitality, trucking. We look at a number of industries, and at that level, it's not quite as abstract as the higher levels. of the political economy, but it's also not, it doesn't present quite so many of the problems of trying to get to individual firms. So to the extent we can, we do. So, so the article, excuse me, has three parts. One, historical narrative, thinking about workplace surveillance broadly over the past century. Two, looking at shifts in sectors, technologies, practices, and outcomes. So essentially what has changed over time. And then third, and this is the part Amos will focus on his part of the presentation, we think about costs, we think about the impact on worker power, we think about the impact of tasks and jobs, we think about the impact of perhaps the speeding up of work, disempowering of workers, the reduction of their voice, but also could there be benefits from surveillance? Surveillance is becoming ubiquitous in many sectors of life and certainly in the workplace. So let's look at change over time. So if you look back literally 150 years, one thing you realize is that modern industry and modern capitalism has always had a surveillance aspect to it. Now, we often think of surveillance in the most direct sense of observing workers. And if you look at the early factory system, of course, that's the sort of thing you would see, literally managers and owners observing what workers do. But much surveillance, both in the past and in the present, has been informational, has been ways of recording what's going on, recording workers' movements, workers' tasks, workers' bodies, also workers' minds, a kind of psychological aspect. And of course, all of those things you can see manifested today. Perhaps no better place to see that than, say, an Amazon warehouse, or also in terms of, say, changes in the trucking industry, or the delivery industry, where workers are carefully monitored, like literally their eye movements on the road are monitored, the speed with which they get in and out of the truck and make their deliveries is monitored, the heart rate is monitored, that their stops and starts are monitored, all sorts of ways, information. Of course, with technology, this becomes more and more possible, but the basic drive in order to sort of know workers, monitor workers, and ultimately, we would say, control workers and work has been there for a long time. The methods have changed. Sometimes they've been direct observations. Sometimes they've been more incentive-based systems like piece rates. Sometimes they've been bureaucratic methods of control. And increasingly, this individual tracking and monitoring using various digital technologies. AI, in a sense, is an extension of that, in that you can gather data about people, but you also need ways of sorting it, using it, applying it to decision-making, and algorithmic methods and AI are enhancing that. So even without necessarily changing some of the basic technologies of surveillance, the impact of surveillance is also being altered. One of the conclusions of a long-term look at this, for both historical but also more contemporary, is to recognize that a lot of things don't necessarily start out as surveillance, right? They might start out with positive goals. They might start out with trying to reduce accidents on the job, or they might start out with trying to enhance safety. And that's perfectly valid, and that's something we'll get to at the end, the positive impacts. But it's also worth remembering that many of those same techniques also become ways of gathering data about people and using that data, and ultimately become potential tools for what we would call worker surveillance. So there's often a latent potential in technologies, especially any technology that has an informational component, to act in a surveillance manner. And there's questions about when and where that latent potential is activated. Looking broadly, some of that has to do with management decision-making, some of that has to do with worker power or the ability to resist or push back. And some of that has to do with the vendors or suppliers of those systems and devices. So it's not necessarily a predetermined outcome, but it is an outcome with always a certain latent potential to become increasingly surveillant, and as it becomes surveillant, for the potential to change the balance of power in the workplace. One of the changes that we've seen is, first of all, we spend a lot more time thinking not just about manufacturing, which is maybe the factory is the traditional site of surveillance in the workplace, but also think about the service sector, the gig economy, the platform economy. Anyone who's ever done any Zoom-related work from home knows that it's a great facilitator of communication, a great facilitator of work, but it's also, again, potentially a way of monitoring, surveilling, and controlling workers by attending to how often they are logged on, how often they move their mouses, click their keyboards. and things of that sort. So it's a good example of the latent potential in different areas that are not the traditional sectors of manufacturing. And also, to the extent that we're dealing with service workers who interact with the public in different ways, the public itself can become a surveillance tool. Surveys of employers' feedback, the instant feedback you give to the Uber driver, the stars you rate, all become ways of monitoring that did not necessarily exist either in a more manufacturing, production-oriented economy or in the economy before new technologies facilitated that level of microscopic focus on the customer experience. There are some continuities with these differences. I think there's always been the element or the potential of control. There's always been questions about how much effort one can get for workers, and surveillance can be part of that. Compliance, productivity, whether you're talking about assembly lines or Amazon warehouses. In the United States, at least, it's where we focus. Law has traditionally and continues to give work managers quite a bit of autonomy to engage in these practices. There's little ability of the worker at their workplace, and if their workplace is home or by Zoom, that includes the home as well, to simply opt out of that type of surveillance down to the level of keyboard clicks. This is not necessarily true in other countries, and you see that there's been efforts in the EU to have certain worker rights when it comes to surveillance and certain privacy limitations. And of course, obviously, the obvious answer is that the surveillance, when used in these fashions, can shift power from workers to managers, can eliminate the need for workers to pay higher wages or efficiency wages in order to attract quality workers by using monitoring and surveillance more intently. So it does have a distributive impact or potential distributive impact in terms of the balance between wages and productivity, or between capital and labor. So it certainly has, besides the direct power and control aspects, also has potential impacts on wages as well. So that's the overview. Amos, I'm going to turn over to you to think about the pluses and minuses of what we found. And go ahead.
All right, I'll try to be brief. Ken, could you move to the next slide, please? So to consider what should or shouldn't be done in terms of workplace surveillance, we believe that it is essential to recognize really the multifaceted nature of surveillance practice effects on workers and, of course, equity. I would like to briefly mention some surveillance harms on the one hand, but also benefits, an aspect that receives less attention in the literature than the harms. On the negative side of the ledger, that's the left side in this table, we, like several others, question the approach that posits that workers in the workplace should be fully subservient to their employers, so that when they accept a job, they implicitly consent to almost all forms of surveillance. The workplace, like any other place, is a locus of social relations, and workers cannot be forced to forego important aspects of a person and their dignity. For example, the surveillance of personal correspondence is an assault on a worker's privacy and dignity and should be prohibited unless it could be shown that it is truly vital to the achievement of a business's goals. Surveillance also could lead to considerable psychological or even physical stress. Workers are monitored and often are actively asked to do more and more by their employers as a result. For instance, in a 2023 study on how Amazon's surveillance regime affects workers, the University of Illinois researchers, Gutelius and Pinto, probably mispronounced the former's name, found that the majority of Amazon warehouse workers in their study had to take unpaid time off due to pain or exhaustion. Finally, on the harm side, employers have employed surveillance to weaken workers' collective power. Ken already mentioned that, for example, by sifting through worker correspondence for indications of unionization efforts, and then, of course, quashing those. Something that obviously down the road leads to even a less equitable division of business economic returns between workers and capital. Moving to the right, to the benefits, surveillance also has some positive effects for workers. First, it could help protect workers from false allegations and other forms of harassment and mistreatment by managers. customers, and even co-workers. In a study we're currently conducting of surveillance in the hospitality sector, several hotel receptionists have mentioned in interviews that they find some surveillance helpful in that it helps them prove that certain allegations of misconduct leveled at them by customers are in fact false. Second, surveillance has been used for well over a century, as Ken mentioned, for improving health and safety practices in workplaces. And in this respect, more sophisticated surveillance has proven to improve safety in places like mines, hospital, and a host of other workplaces. Finally, there are examples of how data on work practices has been used by unions and other organizations to advance worker advocacy. So let's move to the last slide, Ken, if you don't mind. Thank you. So given what we know about surveillance in the workplace, and also recognizing the legitimate interest of employers, and there are some legitimate interests, of course, what could be done to improve the position of workers? Regulation, obviously, is a key component of any effort to improve the situation. Regulation that safeguards worker privacy and dignity in the workplace and accepts that the workplace is also a locus of social relations and not just one of economic production. The EU's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, the acronym, constitutes a step in the right direction in this respect. A second promising direction to increase work is to increase worker control. In many workplaces, certainly in the United States, workers are not even informed of whether and how they are being surveilled. Making surveillance visible to workers is certainly an important start. However, it is possible to move beyond that by pushing for a worker voice in how surveillance is employed and where. This is worker employment co-determination of surveillance practices. That might sound familiar to any Germans in the audience. In fact, workers might even have an impact on the very design of surveillance technology. An example of this is the work that has been done by the Tech Solidarity Lab at Carnegie Mellon. Finally, once we recognize the possible benefits of surveillance, whether it has to do with safety, health, protection against harassment, or obtaining better data that would serve workers in negotiations with employers, then it is possible to expand judiciously these particular surveillance practices. So I think I'll stop here on this happy note. Thank you.
Okay, we're basically out of time, but there was one comment in the chat which I think was really interesting. So maybe you could just reflect on this very, very briefly because we do need to move on. And the comment was sort of focused on the sort of, in a sense, the inefficiencies of private sector managers that were spending a lot of time looking at data about timesheets and scheduling, and employees then feeling like they were being spied on and not listened to, and this sort of negative dynamic that emerged. And sort of how is it that, and I think that that's a good characterization of a lot of the way this sort of operates at the workplace level. What is it, I guess, from your work that would suggest sort of how one could get around that, or sort of come to what shapes sort of where you end up in that world versus other scenarios?
Okay, so let me take that. So first, it's a very good question, and it's actually a way to connect our paper to the work that Jane and Bao and Nicole just presented. And I'll give an example. First, to the issue itself. One of the co-authors of this paper, Karen Levy, which unfortunately is not with us, has a research now about cashiers and automatic cashiers. And one of the most interesting things that she found is that the workers, those same workers that in the questions are being spied on, now because of automatic cashiers actually have a new role. They have to manage the expectations of clients that get really angry about the machine. And what they would actually love, and we find it also in the hotels and the interviews that we have now, is they would love to have that surveillance and some of those technology, but they actually want to have a little bit of more management involvement. What they find very difficult with surveillance, especially when it goes with automation of their chores, is that when they have a question, they don't have a manager. When there are issues or they want to offer suggestions, they don't have a manager. So that is correct. The managers are now too much tied to data, not tied enough to the workers, but also the way that the work is now managed, because you have a surveillance and automation systems, actually prevent management to even giving help to the workers. The other examples, and where I think we need to think even more deeply about those issues, I just had an interview with a person who is both a bus driver, but also own a small bus companies for conferences and stuff in California. They have surveillance, which they actually liked, which helped with safety and also preventing people from claiming that the bus driver did something. It is now, unfortunately for him, and I'll explain in a minute, also mandated by insurance regulation, supposedly for the better, right? Safety and lower insurance. But really, what really happens and what they are very unhappy with, the workers, is that they know that all this data is now sold to artificial intelligence that then are trained on that in the aim of replacing the drivers. The problem here is that they have no say about how those surveillance technologies will be used. So surveillance technologies that in the beginning they were very much for, now they're very much against, and it's only because of a practice in California about who owns the data and who can sell it to whatever other uses. Thank you so much for your question.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we have to move on. I think this conversation could keep going. But thank you, all of you, for this fantastic paper. I'm going to turn over to Amos now to introduce the next session.
We are now going to move to Christoph Bantrenauer from Lyon, Olaf Sorensen from UCLA, and Marianne Feldman from Arizona State University, who are going to speak with us about prosperous places, processes, policies, and practices. The floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you. MS, can you hear me? I
yes,
have a little bit
perfectly.
Of congestion. Very good. And so this has been an incredibly fun paper to work on. It's part of an incredibly fun and informative research project. We ask a very simple question, which is what makes places truly prosperous? And we argue that prosperity is not just about high levels of economic output, but also about well-being and the equitable distribution of resources and opportunities. We define place not only as an administrative unit like a city or a region, but as any geographically contiguous community with a degree of autonomy and agency. And we recognize that place operates at multiple spatial scales, from neighborhoods to metropolitan areas, and its boundaries are as much social as they are geographic. What really matters is a common purpose shaped by social interactions and historical context. And we ask really, I think, a fundamental question. Why do some places manage to combine economic dynamism with social inclusion while others do not? Our core argument is that prosperity should be understood as the joint outcome of value creation and value distribution. A place is not truly prosperous if it generates wealth, but those benefits are only concentrated among a narrow segment of the population. We show that prosperity is not an outcome of market forces or historical luck, but something that can be shaped through deliberate institutional design, through things like housing policy, infrastructure, ownership model, and governance arrangements. We offer a broader and integrative view for thinking about regional development. We move beyond the traditional focus on innovation and growth to emphasize how places can be organized to produce not just wealth, but shared prosperity. To develop this further, I'm going to turn this over to Olaf, who will talk about our specific framework and the 4 features we find are associated with prosperous places.
Great.
Olaf,
Thank you, Marianne. So this, sort of chart, I think, is a good overview of the framework that we're putting together. So essentially, what we were trying to do is look at the literatures in economics, geography, sociology, management, to try to understand, what were characteristics of places that led to processes that seemed to then influence levels of inequality within those places. And so there's really, we would think about maybe 2 types of sets. So we could think about the organizations that exist in a particular location. So we could think about, probably primarily those that are headquartered there, but also those that happen to have other operating locations in an area. And we intentionally label those organizations because we're thinking about these not just in terms of commercial ventures, but also things like nonprofits and other organizations that might be operating in an area. And then the other key element here is aspects of the community. And so I'll go through, kind of each of the 4 components of this, talk a little bit about what the underlying processes, and then how we were sort of thinking about this as organizing the literature. So the first one that we have is organizational demography. By organizational demography, we mean, what is the diversity of types of organizations that are in a place? So that could be types in terms of different industries, types of different businesses, or again, types of organizations, including nonprofit organizations. What's the age of those organizations? In particular, what is the size of those organizations, and how many are there? With a couple of the reasons why demography matters a lot in the literature for the local level of inequality. One has to do with scale. So organizations tend to have less differentiation in pay within them than we find across organizations. So in locations that have larger organizations, you tend to actually have less inequality than in places that have many smaller organizations. A second aspect of this is in terms of sorting. So you can actually have assortative matching between employers and employees. And so places where there are lots of organizations, particularly lots of organizations that perhaps are, vertically oriented. So think about, restaurants of different quality levels, from the fast food to the Michelin star, can actually sort individuals across those. The more talented cooks end up as chefs in the Michelin starred restaurants. Those who maybe have less training or less aptitude end up being at the fast food restaurants, and then that can have consequences for their relative earnings as well. A second component of organizations that we think is, sorry, before I go forward, I should say, and then, the last part of each of these 4 quadrants that we're looking at is to think about what might be policies that actually influence the differences in these from place to place. So demography, for example, we might think of as something that is, largely exogenous or somewhat kind of immune to policy, but there are policies that influence the demography of organizations. So for example, if we think about policies that are oriented towards promoting entrepreneurship, that's actually trying to create new small scale and young organizations. So that could increase inequality by reducing the average scale and increasing sorting in an area. The second aspect is ownership. We actually think this is one that's quite interesting, but perhaps there's less research behind it. So this is really thinking about what is the distribution and the structure of the ownership, primarily of the organizations within a region. So at one extreme, we could think about something like private equity, where the ownership is often quite concentrated. And importantly, not only is the ownership concentrated, the ownership is also typically sits outside the region. So the owners are not also members of the community. At another extreme, we could think about a co-op structure, cooperative, where all of the members of the community, whether that's the employees or perhaps the customers, are part owners of the organization, and also they typically belong to the community. So in general, these ownership structures, the more concentrated the ownership, of course, you're going to get more higher levels of inequality. We also think that foreignness is going to tend to increase inequality within regions when the ownership of of organizations tends to be primarily from outside of the region. The second two cells are looking at aspects of the community. So the first is integration. By integration here, we really have in mind something like, what's the level or degree of social cohesion? More really an informal basis. Are there social networks, relationships connecting people within the community? That can affect the level of inequality in it through a couple of channels. One, again, as Marianne indicated, one aspect of this is what's the rate of growth, and more integrated communities tend to be more innovative. They're more likely to make novel connections between ideas or between resources that actually generate wealth. So that can be inequality decreasing. And then there's another aspect of integration, which is access to resources. So, here we oftentimes have in mind public resources, things like schools, parks, and so forth. And those tend to be more equally distributed in more integrated communities. And then the last component that we're looking at is what is the governance structure? And this sits someplace between the formal and informal. So this is how is decisions made in the local community. Some of that could be very formal. How does the local government operate? How does it, get input from the local population? Some of it, though, may be informal, more like norms of how decisions are made in a place. That again can influence the level of inequality through a couple of channels. One is a coordination channel. We think coordination, again, coming back to the creation of wealth, coordination often helps to create more wealth within a community. And then the distribution is really, for the resources that are generated publicly. Think about what is the local government, for example, doing with tax dollars. Are those allocated to public goods that will benefit a large share of the population, or perhaps channeled towards, kind of small segments of the community? So those are the four components. Under each of them, there's a fair amount of research basis, I would say, about the processes that we look at. Where we think there's a lot of opportunities for future research is in thinking about the connections between policies and these, various sort of levers, and how those then might play out in terms of creating differences in inequality across communities. So with that, I will turn it back over to Marianne, who will bring us in with a final observation.
Oh, very good. And so, of course, we always want to present the empirical case. And so here we are looking at, okay, thank you, this sort of global livability index against how well the city's startup ecosystem is ranked, and looking at places that seem to be achieving a high level of growth, but also to be very livable, to have this shared prosperity. So you can see on here Melbourne, Vienna. We also see Toronto and Vancouver, Copenhagen. These are sort of iconic cities who have been able to implement policies to achieve this. And then we also calibrate this to the size of the population and also the continent where they are located. And so, I mean, this gives us sort of an aspirational set. And I think in this short article, which is really only a beginning and laying out a framework, there's a lot to be done to examine these individual places and to understand how we've drawn this regression line for the average. But places like Jakarta, Nairobi, Manila, that are far below this line raise questions. Gosh, Olaf, I'm realizing that Los Angeles is actually below that average line. But I think that, we hope that this lays out a framework for really actionable policies, practices, and procedures that could be implemented so that we can increase prosperity, more inclusive prosperity. I think that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. For basically, I think that what we'll do is I'll ask one question. Maybe it's going to be there's one sort of more of an academic question that I was interested in, but I'll ask a more policy question that also relates to the next paper, the one that I co-authored. And here it is. I wonder how prosperous places relate to their geographic hinterland, so to speak. Are they also better at fostering growth around them than the others, or precisely because they are inclusive? For example, one of the things you mentioned in the article is that there's relatively easy access to housing stock in prosperous places. They actually tend to siphon human capital from nearby towns. So if you could perhaps offer some thoughts about that.
That's actually something that we did not consider because we're looking at, in our definition of place, if there is shared agency and decision making, then the sort of suburbs, the hinterland could work with the central city. But, this sort of, I think our focus is much more, given that you have this autonomy, what policies might you implement to improve the lives of the residents in that location? Olav, is that fair?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, we made a very explicit choice when we were thinking about the literature and how to organize it, that we really wanted to think about inequality within a place, right? And there's obviously also inequality across places. Those could be related, but we decided, as a kind of boundary condition, we were going to really focus on this, kind of internal inequality. It's kind of interesting to think about how then that might influence the relative attractiveness of places in terms of, attracting people to either, live there or both live and work there. Are they, and you can imagine that that's not necessarily simple function, right? Because but we're labeling a prosperous place, which has lower inequality, might be attractive to a large share of people, but at the very top end of the distribution, right? You might actually, like, if you're somebody who can earn $1 million a year working for an AI company in San Francisco, you may not care so much about whether that's broadly shared or just, where you can garner the highest returns yourself.
Well, thanks a lot. Just one request from one of the audience members. If you can enter the chat, and one person asked for your email addresses so he could contact you later on, that would be wonderful. Thanks a lot.
So, thanks to Amos. It is a delight to present this session on this paper by Amos, Kwon, and Jang Ho. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Donnie. So unfortunately, Kwon couldn't be here with us today, but Jung Ho is here. We have a division of labor, so I'm presenting. And whatever tough questions you have in store, please ask Jung Ho. So Let's start with developmental state. Some countries have played catch up and employed innovation-driven industrial policy, and they have experienced considerable success, some of them obviously, and narrowed, even closed the gap between themselves and the leading economies of the world. We're talking here about, of course, late developers. I'll talk later about our two case studies, Israel and Korea. By Korea, of course, I mean South Korea. However, rapid growth on the national level has oftentimes been accompanied by growing disparities between a highly advanced region, the center, so to speak, not just geographically but economically, and laggard regions that are falling increasingly behind. That's a periphery. However, it should be mentioned that this growing gap between center and periphery has proven to be a problem, not just in late developers, but in many highly developed countries' frontrunners. So this is a common problem, the growing gap between periphery and center. Government in different places has responded with place-based economic development programs for laggard regions. Success has often been elusive. Josh Lerner wrote this wonderful book about the failures, Boulevard of Broken Dreams. Read it if you haven't. But there are also examples that show that well-designed programs could help relatively backward regions advance and even close the gap between the center and the peripheral regions. However, what often goes unnoted is that while the inter-regional gap might narrow, at the same time, intra-regional inequality might grow considerably because the economy grows in one major hub, but really very little anywhere else in the region. This brings us to the main challenge that we address in the paper. What type of policies might help close both the inter and intra-regional inequality? So the foci of inclusive innovation policy should be on place at different levels. Between countries, and then you might have catch-up, between regions, and also within the regions. We argue that to achieve these goals, it is crucial that the policies chosen meet three criteria. First, inclusive innovation, well, obviously must be inclusive. The policy should aim to achieve a more equitable distribution of resources, opportunities, and outcomes. Second, while for many the most obvious set of mechanisms for achieving greater social equity is to make use of a welfare state. The welfare state, and I'm sad to say this because I'm a welfare state scholar, has limits. To boost welfare in the periphery, the policies must be effective from an economic perspective. Third, and this is something that I think receives less attention than the other two criteria in economic development literature, for a policy to succeed, it must be politically viable or it will be short-lived. So to some, we ask what policies, specifically innovation policies, would be successful in achieving both greater inter and intra-regional equity and tick the three boxes: social equity, economic efficiency, and political viability. We explored the question by focusing on two countries that we know quite well, both for political economy and for innovation systems, Israel and Korea. Why should we be interested in Israel and Korea? Well, apart from the obvious fact that it's convenient for us coming from these countries, they are appropriate case studies because they are innovation-led countries. In 2020, this is the first row. Israel was first in R&D spending as share of GDP, and Korea was second. And inequality, unfortunately, is significant from a comparative perspective in both countries, both in terms of a Gini coefficient and in terms also of spatial inequality. So if we're thinking about the Gini coefficient, both countries are in the top third of OECD countries. And when we're thinking about spatial inequality within the country, in Korea, Seoul and adjacent capital regions lead in terms of innovation, economic growth, and income per capita. with periphery regions unfortunately falling considerably behind, and the gap is growing over time. The same holds for Israel, which is quite surprising given Israel's compact nature, small size, with the Tel Aviv area, which has the moniker of the state of Tel Aviv, distancing itself from most of the rest of the country. So given these issues, what policies have we found that could meet the goal of greater interregional and intra-regional equity in the two countries, and also tick the three boxes of social equity, economic efficiency, and political viability? The first policy on the left is associated with the question of where to invest. The answer is obviously that you should invest in innovation in the periphery, but the emphasis should be on large cities as far as possible. The reason is that while investment in small towns may seem attractive in terms of social equity, because it spreads the wealth more evenly on the spatial dimension, everybody should get some innovation investment, the argument goes, then there is a problem from an economic perspective, because from an economic perspective, the return on investment in small places is considerably smaller than investment in large cities. This is very clear, for example, in the Korean investment in innovation hubs, 10-year program with 10 innovation hubs. The economic returns for four large cities, peripheral cities that were included in the program was much higher than the 6 innovation hubs in smaller places. And the large cities also had large positive spillover effects. The second question to your right is what to invest in. In the past, the answer was that government should invest in firms and infrastructure. However, it is clear from studying relatively successful cases such as Yokneam in Israel or Gwangju in Korea, hopefully I'm pronouncing it correctly, that investment in people is no less, if not more important. You need to have people who want to live in these innovation-driven towns. A successful innovation hub should be very livable. For example, you have to have different entertainment options. Otherwise, they will look for work in the center. Now, looking at the time, unfortunately, I don't have the time to discuss this, the diffusion from large peripheral cities to smaller towns, but simply hoping for spillover from the large city to smaller places in the region is not going to cut it. It's not going to attain intra-regional equality. To succeed, there must be complementary policies to the innovation policy that targets the large peripheral town. These policies strengthen the diffusion from the large city to the smaller towns and the hinterland areas that I asked about beforehand. So, what lessons can we draw from the two case studies in terms of policy? We need to think about both where to invest and what to invest in. In terms of where to invest, I think that the table here is actually quite helpful. If we invest in the central areas, the center, so to speak, the outcome obviously would not constitute inclusive innovation. The disparities between center and periphery would simply grow. Moreover, it could also be negative from a political perspective. Growing frustration in the left-behind regions could boil over and find its way into the political field and perhaps lead to the rise of populism, as we've seen in different places like the United States. Investing relatively uniformly across the periphery, and that is the right-hand column over here in the table, appears to be inclusive because everybody gets something. And the Israeli case also indicates that politicians just love that type of policy. A former head of a main innovation agency in Israel told me in an interview that the minister in charge urged him to invest all the government R&D budget in peripheral firms, presumably because they want to take credit, that is the politicians, for place-based investment. The problem is that economically, this leads to major waste, and in the longer run, it achieves very little in terms of equity. The peripheral places simply do not advance. we argue that the most promising avenue is investment in large peripheral cities coupled with diffusion mechanisms not necessarily related to innovation policy that would help spread the wealth. So, to conclude, so we argue that to advance greater inter and intra-equity through place-based innovation policy, governments should first primarily target innovation investment to large peripheral cities. Second, they should balance between investing in firms and investing in people. And finally, create or strengthen diffusion mechanisms from large cities to smaller towns to encourage positive spillovers. But this leads to that question, but always apply to case studies. How generalizable is this? Is it? Perhaps. But as could be expected, we recommend future studies in other places to investigate this. However, what I think is generalizable, and I think could be the main takeaway, is that when thinking about inclusive innovation, we should first think of equity across geographic space on different levels, both inter and intra-regional. This is something that is mostly overlooked. So if you want equity, think about space at different levels, think about different places. Second, we should also make sure that whatever policies are chosen, they should tick the three boxes, the three criteria: social, equity, economic, and political. Thank you.
Thank you, Amos. Can you stop sharing, please?
I'm trying to do that.
Good. Okay. So while Amos, it's in the top, should be at the top of your Zoom. Lovely. So while Amos is struggling with innovation,
with technology in general, as we know.
Yeah, showing that it's not always a good thing. One thing that we have forgot to mention, and there was a few questions about it, all the articles, and it was very important for us, and we thank ICC for that, Industrial Corporate Change, are free for download. You do not have to be an academic. You do not have to have access through a special library. You can just go to the journal and download the paper, no matter who you are and where you are. I also remind anyone who wants to ask a question for this paper, use the Q&A tool, which neither Amos nor me know how to use, so hopefully you can tell us. Now, specifically with this paper and with innovation between the periphery and the center, let me ask you a somewhat cynical question. And the somewhat cynical question is that this has been an issue as basically since people start living in states and countries, but especially so since the Industrial Revolution and innovation. And as you have also mentioned, there hasn't been a lot of gain in making anything actually happen about it, at least in some countries like the United States, and from what you just showed us, South Korea and Israel as well. But strangely enough, for political scientists, there's been a lot of political motivation to do that. So this is not a case in which nobody has done anything about it. This is a case in which trillions of dollars have been supposedly invested to do something without the needle moving that much. So what does a focus on innovation equity can help both us to understand what's happening, but also policymakers to actually move a needle?
Jung Ho, would you like to take the question?
Amos, Django, one of you, please.
Yeah, I think that's a good cynical question. First of all, I think the cases of Israel and Korea can apply to other countries, such as European countries. Which let me share the experience of South Korea and Great Britain. So for the Great Britain of the UK is also a similar problem. So for example, it's a population density very, very high in London. Outside is cold left behind. But when I compare the South Korea, UK, the main difference between is more invest in uh, large publicity, so-called second tier city. For example, in South Korea, even though the second tier city exists, the Korean government evenly distributed their investment innovations in second tier and third tier cities. Because as Amos mentioned, the problem comes from uh, distributions was decided by political powers, elected powers. So government missed the point. Another the thing that I mentioned is I want to mention why STEM workers want to live in poor region. For example, is usually it's R&D center is located in uh, city. The plants were some manufacturing plants located outside plants. However, is the STEM workers do not live in prepared cities. The problem is the main problem is the lack of some human infrastructure such as childcare or any some communities or any cultures and uh, entertainment complex. I think that however is that simply Korean government believe that whereas Israeli government believe that if we government built up some good infrastructure for firms, STEM workers could move there. The the fact was totally opposite. Even though there is an infrastructure for firms that accommodate the STEM workers, STEM workers did not move that. Yeah. I think so. Usually, traditional industry policy, innovation policies believe workers and there's beliefs are same, but I think that they have different beliefs. Could you add more some cases about Israeli failure or success?
So let me then maybe edit with, because of time issues, with also a question from the audience. Amos, can you also, when you think about this, talk about equity, innovation, implication of climate change, environmental sustainability, and related processes, practices, and policies, and whether they fit into the research frame? So I'll give an example which is not in Canada and not in Israel and Korea, but in California. The California Central Valley is one of the world's most strategic places to produce food. It is actually have a lot of highly educated people. It is right next to Silicon Valley, and yet, strangely enough, not only bear the full burden of climate change, so it's more and more horrible to live there, but the inequalities just next door to San Francisco are people that living in the salary level, wage level of Appalachia, which is not high for those who don't know the United States. It is as low as it can get in an industrial society. Amos?
Well, of course, to begin with, having sustainable environmental policies over not even the long run, now we're talking about really short, medium term, is a precondition for having any sort of prosperity. If we don't have that, it's not going to work. And any type of innovation policy that you implement, really any type of policy, you also have to think about how does this actually serve environmental sustainability purposes. Otherwise, you're not going to have in the long run any type of innovation that is going to do you much good. So think about it as a precondition first. Second, though, one of the things that I think could actually be an opportunity for the periphery is that in some ways the periphery is well placed for innovation, say in renewable energy. We have seen that not just in developed countries, but more and more in developing countries. That there's only so much it can wait until the Hormuz blockade ends and all that. You need energy. And where are you going to get that energy? And actually, you have space in the periphery. It can be used to generate, whether it's from wind farms, from solar, and so on and so forth, energy. But to do it in an efficient way, you have to have more and more innovation. And actually, over there, you have the conditions, really the geography that often enables that. So I would say that advancing climate policy could also be a major opportunity, at least for some of the peripheral regions.
Well, thank you both so much, and thanks everyone who has been with us so far. It is now my pleasure to introduce one of the network advisors, Woody Powell, who will help us summarize both the special issue, the day, and the last few years of the network, together with the editors of a special issue, which is Amos, Jane Gingrich, Olav, and myself, if you also want to join.
Okay, hello everyone. Good morning from the West Coast. This has been a really interesting ride with the project and the special issue. I think at the core of this was a group of people who found a common language and a common set of interest and developed, I think, a really interesting set of papers that make the case that equity isn't necessarily a brake on innovation, but could be built into it, could be a foundational element and a really critical part of any innovation economy. And at the core of that is, I think, a focus on governance structures. And maybe I'll end talking more about that. And then ways of understanding governance structures and what might be metrics or some tools that would help us measure the accountability of systems. I like a lot the idea that all the papers share that they reject this common frame of rising tide lifts all boats and make it clear that innovation also often produces dramatic inequalities if not channeled in the right way. So I think at the core of the volume is a consideration of design choices. Think of the example that Danny gave about surveillance technologies, where the bus drivers actually liked the technologies and thought they were very useful for their work, but had no control over the sale of the data. I went to elaborate efforts on a new car I bought to disable the technology that tracked where I drove. It was a nice thing to have. It was useful in terms of keeping track of things. But I discovered the auto company sells that data to insurance companies. And somewhere buried in a sales agreement was a note that I had given permission for that to be done. It's those kinds of design features with technologies, I think, that create many of the hidden inequalities that need to be addressed. So I think, the Places paper raised a really interesting question about, the relationship between governance and integration. Who gets to participate? And as Olaf was talking, I thought about the Bay Area Business Council, which is a community-wide business council. So on many dimensions, that's a very important thing. The former mayor of Oakland is going to be the new leader of it. It has more than 200 different small cities represented by the council. It's an interesting group to think about. It's not powerful in terms of traditional authority. It has no, political control over organizations or communities. It's been, in some respects, quite excellent at raising area-wide issues, particularly with regard to the environment. It's weighed in on current debates around taxes. And it's pushed, but I would say been very unsuccessful with trying to get transportation that works for the entire Bay Area. That coordination between local, state, and federal has failed. And like every organization in the Bay Area, it talks about housing, but it's largely incapable of doing very much about that. And so I think that raises two questions for us as we go forward. And I'd love to hear the other authors think a bit about this. As you talk about design, there are ways in which a lot of the design considerations are in some ways retrospective. How much do we fix the mistakes of the past? What do we do about housing when we have a booming economy for some and others are priced out? That seems to be a common kind of policy debate. And on the other hand, one could think about design choices that are forward-looking, that anticipate a world that is to come. And so the debates we're having in California and New York City is having over wealth taxes strikes me as an interesting way to think about redistribution in the future. You also see peripheral places now starting to have debates over data centers. And I think there's a vote coming in Maine that will outlaw data centers in Maine, essentially saying we don't want this kind of growth. We don't want these kinds of environment destroying, energy sucking sinners in our community. So this contrast between thinking about design that fixes things and thinking about design that anticipates things, I think is an important distinction to make. And then I'd also like to know more, and this would be from all the papers, in a kind of Eleanor Ostrom way of how do we organize polycentric governance? How do you create a voice for multiple participants so that even given the inequalities in their wealth generation and inequalities in their power within organizations, they have relative equalities in their seat at the table. And I think finding examples like that would be really important. And lastly, let me say something about the polycentric governance of this group, because everyone, I think, really deserves a pat on the back. This was a group that came together in the fall of 2019 for the first time. It wasn't but half year later that we had the global pandemic begin, and we spent several years interacting like we are now on Zoom, and continually building and changing the group in terms of its composition. So it was a very fluid group. But at the same time, trying to get people from really different disciplines, geography, economics, political science, public policy, sociology, management, to come together around a core set of issues, dealing with both the desire for building a better future, but also building a more equitable future. And I think Jane and Danny and Amos deserve a real pat on the back for making that possible and for practicing polycentric governance. So I'll turn it over to you guys.
Jane, since Amos and I just talked so much and you had a brief relief, how about you start and then we'll join you.
Thanks, Woody, for those thoughts. I just want to apologize also to my co-author Nicole before that I didn't give her a chance to talk during our presentation. So just want to start by saying sorry to her. But so I think Woody, that's right, right? So like there's a sense of which if we're thinking about kind of and maybe I'm channeling a bit of Jim Scott here, if we try to sort of project a way to promote growth and we end up in this sort of seen like a state trap, right? Where you end up with trying to impose a particular structure on a particular place based it maybe on the lessons of the past. Maybe it's more sort of there's more feedback loops than in that way of thinking about things, but still that there's something sort of static or limiting about sort of going out, surveying the world as it exists, finding out what produces equity and saying, okay, here's a policy solution. So I think the challenge then becomes how do you create institutions that are more experimental, more adaptive, that are more that have the ability to sort of move in directions that you didn't initially see. And that requires sort of giving up on an idea of a singular growth model or a singular way of doing things, but thinking about institutions that have more capacity to achieve equitable outcomes in the long run. And here I think there are some lessons that come out of the work kind of collectively. So the first is and thinking a little bit of some of Marianne's work on private equity and so on, is like you don't want to sort of hollow out the capacities of either local places or the central government to sort of make policies. And that doesn't mean that the state needs or local governments need to direct everything. Clearly, the private sector is going to be the engine of growth in most cases. But one of the kind of failures, I think, of the sort of last 30 years, at least in sort of thinking about economic development, was to try to make the state mimic the market in many ways. And so there's a lot of use of consultants, a lot of use of contracting out, a hollowing out of local capacity. And that undermines the ability of kind of experimental governments that adapts. And I'd say the same about sort of civil society organizations. So like obviously our paper was very much about the labor side of things, but again, labor can be can be a force that stops innovation in some cases. That's certainly true. But there's ways in which some kind of collective organizations, whether they're on business or labor, other things, are necessary to sort of bring things along in ways that can sort of create that kind of coordinating capacity that you were talking about in the sort of Ostromian sense at the local level. And that might not look the same again as sort of past forms of that, but I think that there's ways in which that sort of intermediate level needs to be sort of enhanced, whether that comes through policy or through other actions. And so this is like kind of a waffle of an answer, but I do think one of the lessons I would take out of our collaboration and sort of the broader literature that we've engaged with is like there's a real danger in trying to take a sort of one size fits all approach. And so the challenge is thinking about governance as a sort of living sort of set of institutions, and how do you create the best chance that's baked in terms of thinking prospectively about that. And some of that's going to be about sort of maintaining capacity for actors on the ground that are genuine counterweights to sort of powerful interests, but that could also work with them. Others will be, doing the kinds of things that we were thinking about in a research sense, about sharing good ideas, having institutions that sort of sit above some of these units that share ideas. So thinking about one of the members of the group that's not here, but Christoph Brantner's new book, Cities in Action, which is a really fabulous book that looks at sort of the diffusion of climate policies across cities. And for him, both the internal capacity of the city administration with the organizations on the ground, but also the sort of collaborative architecture across cities are what allows cities, in his case, to take innovative actions on climate. And I think that that kind of insight of building those kinds of infrastructures becomes really critical to thinking about how we can be more forward looking on some of these questions.
Two quick things. One, a shout out to Christoph. He had a baby girl born yesterday, Alma, so he's a new parent. And Civic Action is a really interesting book because it talks about that infrastructure. And what's so interesting in the book is that it was often civil society organizations that took the lead as innovators around green housing and green buildings. And it was later then that the private sector picked up on those innovations, and he shows that throughout the cities. And I think your idea of creating or sustaining capacity for counterweights is really important. But to channel the Jim Scott and a few kind of metaphors in your talking, I think the contrast between following a recipe and learning how to cook is really a good one. In a recipe, you think there's one way of doing things and you follow it religiously. Cooking, you taste every step and change. And it evolves depending on what the dish is becoming. And so finding a way to have cooking rather than recipe, and then cooking with many cooks, which is very hard, would be a good direction. Okay, over to either Danny or Amos, or Olaf, excuse me, too. I apologize.
Yes. So, first of all, I want to invite Olaf if he wants to come join us. But the other is, yes, we are expanding the network on a monthly basis. Bao, who was here before. So congratulations to all the IAP newborn and babies.
Yes.
Amos, how about you say a few last words, then I'll maybe...
Okay, I'll be brief. First, thank you very much for everything over here, and also your incisive comments, Woody, and compliments, of course. I always like compliments, to pat on the back. One thing sort of picking up on anticipating, I had discussions with a couple of policymakers about anticipation, not about anticipation versus fixing, but about anticipation. And they said, well, really, how do you expect us to do anticipatory policy? Because, the future, is obviously uncertain. So how do you do that? And my answer basically was, well, you're doing it all the time. And here it is. First, when I was speaking with them, and these are people sort of more in the innovation world, I guess, one thing is you're doing it, but you're thinking about future economic growth. So there's the issue of objectives. So you're doing it, but when you're doing it in the social field, you're asking, how can we anticipate? There's no such qualms when you're doing it in the economic field for economic objectives. It can be done. Second, and this relates to the polycentric governance theme, is that so much of what is being done successfully over time actually develops from unforeseen places. All right, and this could be really the civil society organization. These could be low levels of government. And you have to have room at the table. You have to have room at the table and also afford resources for what is how to learn cooking, all that trial and error. And then we, along the way, can figure out what works better and what works less. And obviously, there is no one size fit all. As Jane was saying, there are different recipes. But if all we have is one government policymaker that basically only cares about how to grow GDP per capita, we won't go very far. That's not the way.
So I'll thank everybody here, but I will follow up on Amos's in just a few words. I think one of the most enduring lessons that I had from working with this network and working as a policymaker, working with policymaker and working on innovation is that the problem is not actually having successful small experiment that works on the ground. So it's not just the capacity on the ground. Yes, I agree, that's really important. But where we fail most of the time is recognizing that the experiment is a successful one and then scaling it up. And that's, if there's something that I will answer to the central policymakers, to the biggest foundations out there, because some countries, including in North America, we shouldn't expect them to do anything now, is an ability to not just organize experiments, but actually understand that the reality is an experiment, figure out which one of them is successful, and helping them to scale up. Not whether you funded it in the beginning or not, but the ability to understand, map up what is happening, understand what works, scale it up, put it up on the global debate, I think is as important as starting it or giving capacity. With that, I think we had a wonderful session. We're only about 5 minutes deep into it, meaning too much into it. So I think as academic, I will give all of us another pat on the back to follow Woody. We actually managed to be in time. I will remind everybody again that all the papers are completely free for download, no matter who you are, where you are. You don't need to go to an academic library. You just go to the journal and you can download all of them. And in all of them, you have our email addresses and you can reach out. And again, thank you for everybody. Bye.